Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Susan Charles. She is professor of psychological science and nursing science in the School of Social Ecology at the University of California, Irvine. Her research examines emotional processes across the adult lifespan, and today we're going to talk about affective well-being, emotional function across the lifespan, emotion regulation, social relationships, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Charles, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start perhaps with a definition here. So when it comes to affective well-being, what are we talking about here exactly?
Yes, effective well-being is a term researchers use, and people in the community and society really don't, except we use it every day. So you know how you meet someone and you say, "How are you?" And when someone asks you, "How are you doing?" you kind of think to yourself, "How am I doing overall? Am I good? Am I bad?" And so you'll say, "I'm doing well," or "I'm not." And that is your effective well-being. It's basically how positive you are or how negative. And the way we measure this as in our research is by asking discrete emotions like how happy, how content, how calm. And then we look at the average, and that's your overall like positivity. And so whether it's low or high, and then we also do the same thing for negative, how angry, how sad, like a host of different negative emotions, and then we average those together. And we look at your positive, overall positive bucket compared to your negative bucket, and that's your overall well-being.
Yeah, I mean, isn't there a small risk of people just sometimes lying about their own effective well-being? Because I mean, when we ask one another, how are you doing? We usually say, well, fine, but sometimes that's not really the case.
You're right. Maybe that's a bad example because in society we just default to fine. But it is true, and sometimes we have social desirability, right? So you don't want to look bad, and some people have even wondered, does that change with age? So are you trying to to look more socially desirable, look good at different stages in your life, more or less?
And talking about how things change across the lifespan, how does emotional function change exactly?
Yeah, it's really interesting because emotions, when we think of what emotions are, and they're obviously cognitive processes because it involves thinking, like, how do I feel? And they're behavioral processes, so responding to an emotional event, like fight or flight. And when we think about our thoughts and we think about physical fitness and you think about aging, you think, as I tell my students, there are very few Olympians who are old, so clearly all these physical and cognitive processes decline with age, and that's pretty normative. But emotions actually look pretty well preserved across the lifespan. And when we ask people, "How are you?" or "How's your life been?" like in the past month, generally older adults report similar, if not higher levels of well-being than younger. Definitely, I would take the average well-being of a 60-year-old over a 20-year-old any day because it is higher. So they're generally less negative, like they're less angry or distressed than younger people.
Well, then actually in this particular case, at least that common stereotype that older people tend to experience more positive emotion seems to be correct.
Yeah, it's interesting. Oftentimes stereotypes are either really positive or really negative. So you'll have like the grumpy old man kind of trope, or you'll have, the old witch, or you'll have like the benign, like loving grandma. But the truth is more of the kind of benign look, which is great because we tell young people these are the best moments of your life. And when we think of mental health today, and especially after the pandemic of younger adults, I think it's kind of a child abuse type thing. If we ask, if we tell a 19-year-old, this is the happiest you're going to get, that they might think this is it, and it isn't. I mean, from all the data we've seen, the older you get, well, definitely like the happiest people sometimes are in their late 60s and early 70s. So interesting.
But middle-aged people, I mean, middle age seems to be a bit scary. I mean, I haven't got there yet, but I mean, looking at many middle-aged people out there, it seems to be a very, I mean, a stage in life where people really go down in terms of their emotions and stuff like that.
You know, it's really interesting because there's a question, how satisfied are you with your life?
Yeah.
And we often see this kind of U-shaped curve where it's highest in the younger and the middle age, but in midlife, it gets lower.
Yeah.
And so it kind of, and even longitudinally, you'll see people go
Yeah.
down and then go up again.
Uh-huh.
And people have done a lot of research to kind of reason why life satisfaction is more cognitive, like how is my life going? And they used to think it had to do with like when you got married, you're happier, and then you go down, and then the kids, if you have children, they leave the house, then you go up. But since then, these data have been replicated with people who are not married, and you see the
Mhm.
same kind of dip and then the move up. And so I mean, there's a lot, we don't have a definitive answer, but there's a lot of speculation. And for example, there's a little mortality kind of blip in the 50s.
Yeah.
You see cardio, you know, like a lot of cardiovascular type deaths, like a lot of heart attacks. I mean, not a
Yeah.
lot, but so especially among men, like with everyone's been healthy, and then all of a sudden, like one person in your friendship, you know, network dies about like a heart attack as opposed to an accident. And then you start realizing, oh, people are dying for health related reasons, you know, in my age group. And so that also triggers kind of the mortality. There's a lot of speculation about why that happens, but we do see that too.
Yeah, maybe they think, oh my God, perhaps I don't have 30 or 40 more years ahead of me. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So since you mentioned disease, actually, I wanted to ask you, do we know what are the specific biological changes that across the lifespan affect emotional processes?
So it's interesting about brain, like what changes in the brain that would affect emotional processes. So people have done studies looking at about the brain structure and changes. So for example, what changes first in the brain with age is the frontal lobes, the ones that are important for processing information and judgment, decision making,
Yeah.
and very important for emotion. So if we think, oh, that's the first thing that declines with age, that sounds pretty scary. But what researchers have found is that perhaps this slower reaction time that we see with aging could benefit emotions. I mean, if you think about it, when we say something we regret or say something out of anger, oftentimes we do this quickly. And so maybe the kind of slowing actually helps emotional regulation. That's one hypothesis. And of course, I do have to say that other people have looked at older adults, and the people who have the highest function are remembering the more positive emotions relative to negative emotions. And there are age-related diseases like dementia where we see higher rates of depression. So it's not, oh, you get worse and you get better. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying kind of slowing down and taking things into perspective might also have a kind of biological basis.
So another thing that we have emotion related is emotion regulation. Does that also increase with age? I mean, not only perhaps the kinds of emotions we experience, more positive or more negative, but also our ability to regulate our emotions.
No, this is a really good question because, as I said, you know, we ask older adults how they're doing, and they often seem similar or if not better with age. And yet we do know that more losses in life are associated with older age, that people lose status with retirement or financial, you know, their wealth. I mean, when they retire, they don't make as much money, that friends, you know, you lose friends through illness. And so why is it? So they must be regulating their emotions better. But when we we put older and younger people in the lab and we make them regulate their emotions. So we get them really upset or sad or angry or disgusted, and we see how quickly it takes them to get back to baseline. That's not where we see the age-related benefit. So we see very few actually age differences. People look pretty similar. Where we see older people engage in processes that we think do help daily life is that older adults are less, what we're finding in our research, they're less likely to place themselves in situations that can turn negative. And let me give you an example. So if a younger and an older person both loved a favorite restaurant and it's in LA and the traffic is horrific, and road rage is something that both younger and older people, that everyone uniformly says is unpleasant. Older people might say, you know what, I really love that restaurant, but I'm going to go on Saturday, or I'm going to eat very early or later than the lunch crowd. And so they kind of proactively structure their lives so that they don't get into that traffic jam, or they don't find themselves. If you're talking to somebody and the conversation starts leaning towards a question that you think, no, it's going towards politics and we never get along, or it looks like they're going to start telling a joke and I always find their jokes offensive. Older people are more likely to walk away or to change the topic. They're less likely to press on the conversation that is getting negative. So that's what we find. So it's not regulating a bad state, it's kind of avoiding it in the first place.
And so, in what ways do differences in affective experience relate to things like cognitive and health-related processes?
Yes, so we have done a lot of studies. Dave Almeida at Pennsylvania, at Penn State, and I have collaborated for over 20 years, and he has a wonderful data set looking at daily stressors of life. And so we've looked at age differences and in that, and we've looked at over time how people respond to stress and how it relates to their health 10 years later. And what we find is that on days when you have a stressor, and if you say at the end of the day, how are you feeling? And your emotions really change. So on days without a stressor, you're like, oh, I'm okay. But on days you have a stressor, you're like, oh, that was awful. So the more awful, that you report, the more your emotions change in response to the stressor. That increases your likelihood of having both a physical, a chronic illness, and increases your risk of physical health, and it increases your risk of either anxiety or depression, so mental health as well.
And where do these differences in affective experience stem from? Do they have to do with some sort of individual differences like personality or some other ways related to information processing, the way we deal with our own experiences in life? What are they related to exactly?
We think there are many differences. So it can start with just temperamental differences. So we often talk about temperaments of dogs, for example. This dog has a different temperament than that dog. So we see this in animals, and we see this in humans too, with even newborn babies. Some cry easily, some just sit and are really kind of, easier to care for because they don't need as much soothing. And so we see these differences unfold across the lifespan. Some people are frightened very easily. Other people think it's hilarious. So if some new loud sound comes into their arena. So we have these temperamental differences, and we do see that these personality that unfold into personality traits over time. And we see that certain personality traits are related to higher reactivity to our stressors. And we also, so from modeling behavior, so how our parents responded can also influence us, and how we're learned to deal with our own emotional experiences and what scares us, or what's novel in the stimuli. Like if you grow up in a place where anything new can be potentially very dangerous for you, then you might have a very different outlook than someone who is raised in a safer environment, for example. So a combination of what you came into the world with and how the world has shaped you.
Mhm. And I would imagine, of course, that earlier we've talked about, let's say, general trends across the lifespan, but you've also mentioned some opposite stereotypes that we have for old people, like the grumpy old man or the carefree old man, let's say. And I guess that some of that would also be the result of these individual differences, like personality, temperament, and so on, right?
Yeah, for the, the upturns that we sometimes see, especially after 65,
Yeah.
some of those upturns in emotional distress can be from certain losses, physical health,
Mm.
like
Yeah.
increases in physical health problems and
Yeah.
cognitive dysregulation from dementia, like cognitive health problems. So,
Mhm.
and also certain losses. So for example, losing social support is so important for everyone,
Yeah.
for everyone's health. But the older you are, and if you start losing enough people, the core people in your life, that can be a very lonely and isolating experience.
Mhm. But by physical health factors, I mean, what do you mean exactly? Are you focusing on specific diseases or, for example, losing mobility or what
No, that's
exactly?
a really wonderful question because it's interesting, like just the concept, the definition of healthy, of success. We used to call it successful aging, and we call it healthy aging. It used to
Yeah.
be you have to be free from disease. That is a healthy aging person. Well, about over 85% of people 65 and older have at least one chronic condition.
Mhm.
And yet around 80% of older adults, if you ask them, are you a successful ager? They will tell you yes. So clearly it's not a disease model, and the absence is a good thing. And the World Health Organization actually now defines healthy aging as whether or not you have an impairment or a chronic illness, it's being able to do what you want to do that makes you happy
Mm.
and engaged in your life. Now, with that said, chronic illness by itself isn't related to lower levels of well-being unless what we've found is if you report having 3 or 4 illnesses or more,
Mm.
then we do see a decline in we do see differences in well-being, lower. I mean, people have lower levels of well-being. And you mentioned functional decline, that
Mhm.
inability to climb stairs or to
Mhm.
walk
Yeah.
far. And that certainly we think is one of the reasons, because the more illnesses, it just increases the risk of, the functional disability and, which leads you to not be able to do what you want to do that keeps you happy.
Mhm. So usually if people have just, for example, one chronic disease, like, I don't know, diabetes or high blood pressure or something, or cholesterol, or perhaps if they just lose some functional capacity, some mobility, perhaps one single, I mean, a single one of those conditions probably doesn't affect people much or
Yeah, we found in looking at large studies, just
Mhm.
the number of illnesses is definitely correlated. However,
Mm.
and you bring a good point. So for example, if you said, well, you can't really see if you take off your glasses, so that must affect your well-being. It's like,
Yeah.
well, it would if glasses weren't invented, definitely.
Yeah.
But I don't think I cope with that very well. Some people might, and so some people do.
Yeah.
But I put on my glasses, I'm fine. So if someone has high cholesterol and they take a lower cholesterol, so chronic illnesses, we think it's the symptoms and the way these illnesses might
Mhm.
impact their daily lives. So if you have an illness but you take a pill or is asymptomatic and doesn't bother you, then we don't see that.
Mhm.
It's chronic pain is especially the uncontrollable chronic pain can be
Mm.
just devastating, just absolutely
Mm.
devastating. But when we look at huge populations of people, usually we see that a real change with that 3 or more chronic conditions.
Mhm.
So
So unless you have really a very severe condition, like for example, chronic pain, I would imagine that the way you adapt to your new life also plays a big role, right?
Right. And yes, and you see some people, as we say in research, we can predict a population, but we can't predict your aunt or your uncle or you. And so some people are incredible and they cope and they do an incredible job. I remember talking to someone who had ALS, a horrible degenerative condition where he had lost his ability to move every part of his body except above the neck. He could talk and he could kind of blink. And he was so grateful for his life and his partner, and he was happier than some of the undergraduates I see at the college who are in peak physical condition. And so I don't want to say everyone, but for many people who lose that function, like losing eyesight, for example, and not being able to drive at night. And then some people have a social network that allows them to drive them, and so it doesn't affect their ability to see their friends and do the activities they want in the evening. Other people live in places where there's public transportation that allows them to be more independent. But some people have a real hard time. They might live in a rural area, for example, that is related to more problems with chronic conditions, because they have less help.
Yeah, yeah, and it's definitely many aspects of aging are very complicated for many people out there. So, but earlier you mentioned being exposed to daily stressors, for example. So when that occurs, when that's the case, do they usually have long-term physical health ramifications or not?
Yes, we find that it does predict physical health problems 10 years later, a higher likelihood of having them. And we think that part of just these daily stressors is the release of cortisol. So cortisol is commonly referred to as a stress hormone in the literature. We all need cortisol. It's a regular part of our body, so it's great. And when we have it and we need it, so if we see something and we need to quickly move, it kind of mobilizes the body and allows us to run away or to fight our enemy, or the bear that's attacking us, a millennial, thousands of years ago. Our ancestors use this to have the energy to fight their fears and their stressors. Nowadays, a lot of our our developed worlds, a lot of our fears and stressors are not something we fight. We just sit quietly in our boardroom or a classroom, or wait in line at a store and have to deal with our frustration, and sometimes we have to smile when we're doing it. And so we're not using this energy just kind of sitting in our bodies. And if we're constantly feeling stress and these daily stressors, like got in an argument with somebody, or there's someone who is really annoying, this is the most common we all have, something really annoying, but you decide to let it go. Just, I'm not gonna engage with this person. And you have that, but you're really upset by it. It really bothers you. Then you're gonna have the stress response that includes this cortisol release. And if you have just these high levels of cortisol and no way to release it, it's going to cause wear and tear on your body. And so it's going to eventually affect your immune system. Your immune system isn't going to work as well, for example, and it's related to worse health later, and more functional declines. It's related to a lot of very bad health risks.
Yeah, when it comes to hormones, I guess it's important for people to keep in mind that there are no bad hormones. What is bad is if you find them, or some of them, in very high concentrations in your blood or in particular parts of your body where they should have been at least in those levels, and some of them in particular parts of the day, because some of them help you go to bed, go to sleep, or wake up in the morning. But perhaps if they are in high concentrations throughout the day and through long periods of time, that's when they have bad consequences. Right.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There are no bad hormones, and in the same way, there are no bad emotions. I remember reading Ledoux's work.
Yeah.
He's a wonderful affective neuroscientist, and
Yeah.
and in his research, he talks about anxiety, for example, and anxiety is a horrible. If people have anxiety disorders, it's very unpleasant. It's very uncomfortable, and yet what he talks about is we would be alive if there wasn't anxiety and fear, because fear has motivated us to stay safe. And so it's a very adaptive emotion and we all need it, but it's just when we have too much of it that it's a problem.
No, and this is a very important point to make here, because nowadays it's very frustrating to all the time hear on social media people bashing certain hormones. Oh, you should do a dopamine detox. And I'm like, man, if you didn't have dopamine in your brain, you wouldn't even be able to make decisions. Come on.
You're so right. There was a study where they had they brought in women and brought in pictures of their babies. All these women had young children, had babies. And when they looked at their babies, they had more dopamine. Their eyes dilated and they had more dopamine. And when people who are in love, when they see the people they're dating, same thing. It's like, you want the person you want your romantic partner to see you and to have a little dopamine release. If they didn't, that's not great for dating, that young love.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't feel much for the person, right? Which wouldn't be good, at least in that context.
For attachment. Yeah.
So, I mean, another thing that I haven't asked you about yet is affective reactivity, or perhaps you've already touched on it a little bit, but what is it and how does it relate to the way people deal with daily stressors specifically?
It's interesting, so as I said, we've talked about these daily diary and how reactive you are to daily stressors.
Yeah.
We always joke with emotion researchers that there are as many definitions of whatever, of emotions, of reactivity, than there are emotion researchers in the room. And so even the reactivity at the end of the day, you say, well, is that reactivity or is that rumination that we're still thinking about it? So some people define reactivity as that second, that initial response. So appraisal theorists, for example, will say when something comes, when you see some emotional stimulus in front of you, the first thing your brain does, even before you actually realize it, is identifies it as, is it a threat or not? And then, is it good for me or not? So these are these initial appraisals, like good, bad, and so once you do that, let's say you say it's bad. So it's like, oh, bad. Then you think, is it going to harm me? Do I have what it takes to deal with it or not? So you're like, okay, I can deal with this. Yes or no, or like, no, I don't. So so that's reactivity for them. We study reactivity at the end of the day. Is it still bothering you? So those are two different definitions of reactivity that we often use. Look at initial reactivity and then longer term reactivity.
So I would also imagine that there would be some, or at least some individual differences here in how people respond to daily stressors, right? Or even perhaps in certain cases, if they even consider it a stressor or not at all, right?
Yes, and Richie Davidson, who's a affective neuroscientist at Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, he talks about the chronometry, the time, chrono for time, the chronometry of emotions. And so he says there are individual differences in so many aspects of the emotional experience. So there's differences in like how angry you get or how happy you get. So in that peak, and then there's differences in how slowly you recover. So do you stay angry or do you stay happy? And you can see this, I think anyone can with friends. They're like, oh yeah, that person takes a long time to get upset, but once they're upset, whoa, stay away. Or it could be the reverse. Like they go from 1 to 100 and then they're fine the next day, or they're fine 5 minutes later. So we see differences in we see differences in even how quickly people respond, how long it takes them to get back down. So in all of the processes that we study, there's these wonderful individual differences.
Mhm. So let's talk a little bit about social interactions and social relationships here, because of course we as humans value those kinds of interactions a lot because there's many aspects of our lives that revolve around them. And sometimes we have negative social interactions and we have affective responses to them. So are there age differences here as well in terms of uh, people's affective responses to negative social interactions?
It's interesting because when we ask people of different ages, um, how often they have negative interactions, older people report them a lot less often than younger people. And older people are more often to say that a negative interaction wasn't as bad compared to a younger person. Karen Fingerman at UT Austin did this wonderful study years ago where she brought adult daughters into the lab with their mothers. So the mothers were in like their 60s and 70s, and the daughters like 30s and 40s. And she brought them in and she had them do a task together that was a collaborative task that was kind of frustrating. And then she separated them at the end, and then she had them report, how was it? And so the moms are like, it was great, it was wonderful. And the daughter's like, yeah, not so much. So even that same interaction, the moms were the older, women were reporting much less negative than the daughters. And we see that just whenever we ask people about about any interactions, that older people are less likely to say they were negative, and they report lower levels of negativity response. So they're generally like happier, we call them like happier relationships because there's less negativity about them.
Mm-hmm.
So, but often if we just ask, how happy were you to see somebody? Sometimes older people, especially family members, will report much higher levels of happiness, but oftentimes, but sometimes you see no differences because younger people do like people in their lives too.
I would imagine that the period of life where people would report experiencing more negative social interactions would be during their teenage years, right?
And also, Laura Carstensen, who did the socio-emotional activity theory that really addresses this, she did a study years ago where she asked people, so would you rather be with a close friend, a stranger? And she had a whole different descriptions of different types of people, and you had to see whether you'd want to interact with them. And one of those was a person you don't really know but you dislike. And she found that some of the people in their teens, some adolescents, said they wanted to interact with that person. No older people did, none in her study. And so she asked these younger, she's like, why would you want to interact with someone you dislike? And the young people would say, I want to know why I dislike them. What is it about that person I dislike? I haven't seen an older person tell me that, but I would doubt that would happen very often. And we don't see that happening very often. Older people generally know why they dislike people. I mean, like what will bother them about a certain type of person. And so they, again, going back to that, so they don't engage or seek to engage in situations where they think, oh no, this is not going to go well.
Yeah, and I guess that with age, we also learn that it's not a problem at all if not everyone out there likes us, right? I mean, if there's one or two people out there that really dislike us, whatever, it's not a big deal. Right?
Yes, you have that. With age, you absolutely learn these wonderful, can't please all the people all the time. And you also have comparisons. So if you meet someone you don't like, them older people say, well, but that was nearly as bad as, when I was fired by my boss, or when, and they'll have this horrible situation in their past.
Yeah.
So they can put it in perspective too, based on their prior experiences.
But in your work, I read you talking about things like goals, appraisals. So what would be the roles that goals and appraisals play in our effective responses to negative social interactions?
Well, I think that, a lot of times when I'm giving talks, people say, how can young people be like older people? And so kind of not take these bad things as seriously. And some is what you said is learning to appraise that,
Mhm.
you know, what's possible and learning to accept what you can't change, for example, about other people. But I also say, you know, I think that older people also in societies, again, in societies where they have a retirement, where they're no longer working, they also have something that younger people don't often have, and that's the ability to avoid something negative. So for example, if you're working and there's negative people that you have to, you know, you're working with some colleagues you don't like, you don't have the ability to just not talk to them. Or, you know, you don't have customers really bothering you. You can't just say, you know, I'm not going to talk to you, you know. So sometimes some older people have, you know, have the ability to engage or not engage, whereas younger people don't often, well, they might not. And so as I joke with people, I say, like, my graduate students, if they said, you know, I don't really want to work on my dissertation, I think I'm just going to take the next month off, you know, I'd say, no, like, you don't have necessarily have the same freedom that older people have gained from their life and their place of where they are, their role in life right now.
Mhm. Yeah, I guess that also when you get old, I mean, there are many more things that you don't care about anymore because, I mean, I can't be fired anymore. I don't need to impress anyone anymore, so I will say whatever I want. Right.
And what we do find, especially and more so for women than men, is that you care less about what other, as you pointed out, that what other people think about you. It's like, oh, they
Yeah.
think I'm an idiot. Okay, you know, it says. Whereas younger people, they're very concerned, and it makes sense if you're thinking, well, this person might be hiring me next week. You know, this person might put in a bad reference for me, or you know, so they might have to. So exactly.
Mhm. And so, I mean, just to close this section before I ask you about another topic, can we say that at least there's a tendency for affective well-being to increase with age?
Yes, based on questions like how happy you are. You know, Art Stone did
Mhm.
a study with almost 500,000 Americans, and they called them and said, today, tell me about
Yeah.
your emotions. And the people, they asked people from age 18 to people in their late 80s, and the happiest people were the age 72. So, so overall, we see well-being. Sometimes we see a slight kind of increase in people after age 65,
Mhm.
but generally we see the highest rates of negative emotions in people in their teens and early 20s.
Yeah. And so earlier you mentioned very briefly rumination. Does that play a role in how levels of affective well-being change across the lifespan? I mean, if some people have a higher tendency to ruminate compared to others, does that have any influence there?
So we have seen in studies that
Yeah.
when you ask people how often they ruminate,
Hmm.
or did something bother you, or you're still thinking about it, that
Yeah.
fewer older adults say they're doing that than younger people. So it's not that older adults handle rumination better, because if you get them to ruminate, it's bad, but they are less likely to do that than
Yeah.
younger people. And again, like, why? And some people think older people are better at letting go and saying things like what you were mentioning, like, hey, can't please everyone, just let it go.
Yeah.
Other people think maybe it has to do with not like remembering better the gist, like, oh, we had a negative conversation, than if you remembered every single detail. Well, he said this, and then she said this, and then he said this, and then I can't believe they said this about me. Whereas if you just said, yeah, this is something negative about me, I don't remember, as opposed, they said that I was, and you remember every single word. And so some people think maybe that could help, but for all these reasons, we see that perhaps, again, some of them have to be tested still, but we do see that older people report lower levels of rumination and
Yeah,
lower levels of regret. Like
mm,
Carson Borsch does incredible research looking at regret, and older
mhm.
people have actually fewer regrets than younger people, even though they've lived a lot longer.
Yeah, I mean, in younger people, it's that typical kind of conversation. Oh, he was there, and then he was like, and I was like, and he was like, and I was like, right? Oh my God. So, and I guess that rumination is also something very highly correlated with mental health conditions like depression, right?
Yeah, and you think about it, if you have a stressor and then you don't ruminate it, don't ruminate on it, you're like, oh, that
Mhm,
happened, that was bad, let's move on. Your body kind of resets, right? And so it's gone. Whereas if
mhm,
you ruminate, you're keeping it with you, you're keeping that stress alive. And so you think if it's whether it's cortisol or whether and we didn't even talk about cardiovascular reactivity, so your heart rate is higher and your blood vessels are constricted, which
yeah,
we know that, over time that can be related to higher incidence of hypertension. So if
mhm,
you have so your vasoconstriction, so you have high blood pressure and your heart rate's going and
yeah.
your blood pressure is going up and you're keeping it like that for long periods of time, because you're ruminating, you're still staying angry, you're still, or whatever emotion you will have. Anger and hostility are probably the worst for health, based on what we've seen in the studies, and you keep that going, then that's very bad for you. I mean, think about, it's worse to have vasoconstriction and like high heart rate and really be aroused thinking about it than if you just calm yourself down and let it go.
Mhm. By the way, one concept I haven't asked you about yet is emotional memory. What is that exactly?
Yeah, so emotional memory, and that's kind of related to what we've been talking about. So it's the memories that you say, hey, remember that summer camp you went to, or that vacation you were on, or how was it? Or that
Yeah.
conversation you had with somebody. And so what we find is for people, regardless of age, we call that
Mhm.
summer camp effect, that it's better than it was. You're like, oh, I had a great time. You're like, wait a minute. Don't you remember as soon as you got back, you said you'd never want to go again? You're like, I will, so we see that most people remember it a little better than they do at the time.
Yeah.
But we see this kind of memory, this difference in how you felt at the time versus how you talk about it now. We see that it's even more positive for older people than for younger people. So we call and Laura Carstensen and Joe Michaels, Mara Mather, they've
Mhm.
done a lot of research on this, and it's referred to as the positivity effect. So their memories are either more positive or they're less negative, but either way, it's a more positive looking back and more positive memory.
So we've talked about how people deal with negative emotion, negative social interactions earlier, but how do social relationships change across adulthood? Do they tend to get better with time or not?
So we think better, and
Mhm,
the driving theory behind that is socio-emotional selectivity theory,
mhm.
that Laura Carstensen developed. And
By the
that
way,
theory,
tell us then a little bit about that theory for also the audience to understand a little bit better
yeah,
what it refers to.
so socio-emotional selectivity theory is a theory about time and time
Mhm.
perspective. And we're
Okay.
not talking about clock time. We're talking about how much time people perceive is left in their lives. So we think everyone has an awareness. All adults have an awareness of how much time they have
Mhm.
left in their lives. This is not something you consciously wake up in the morning and say to yourself, but it's something that you have, that you're kind of aware of. And so when you're younger and you see this broad, vast future, You have many years ahead of you, and you have to plan for those years, and you have to prepare for those years, and you have to think about what you're going to do in those years. And so a lot of your goals are going to be about information and knowledge accruing for that vast future. As you get older, your future is shorter, the time horizons are decreasing, and you have less time ahead of you. And so you can shift and instead of focusing so much on gaining information and knowledge for that future, you can then instead focus on the present, and then by focusing on the present and focus on emotional goals of well-being. And I should have said at the beginning that socio-emotional selectivity theory states that there are two really important goals for all social interactions, and that's gaining information and knowledge, and just enjoying being with a person, the emotional well-being and emotional meaning. And so those are important, very important for everyone, no matter how old you are, but you're constantly kind of gauging the relative importance of these two goals. And so younger, you might sacrifice emotion more for that information, whereas older, you're more likely to focus on the emotion rather than the information. And so the older you get, the more you really focus on this emotional meaning and emotional well-being. And so you'll make decisions about who you want to interact with and what you want to do based on these increased emotional goals. And so, for example, you might want to interact more with close friends and family members because they mean a lot to you, and just like they do for younger people. But hey, do you want to meet this new person that has this new startup company that's really interesting? You're like, I'd rather hang out with my children or my grandchildren. It's not as compelling to them because of their goals than it would be for younger. And so as a result, they're focused on their emotional goals, and they derive a lot of meaning and fulfillment in these interactions, and they report greater happiness selecting these goals.
So in regards to my original question, does that mean then that social relationships tend to get better across the lifespan?
So older people will report greater satisfaction with their families, with their friends. They report greater desire to want to interact with them. And when they've had an argument, then you ask them, was it resolved? They're more likely to say it was resolved, and they're more likely to not be to not be bothered by them as much, or report that they haven't been. So overall, like every way we ask them, it's always better for older people. Better relationships, happier when they're with relationships, fewer arguments, not as upset. So we do think that relationships are better.
So, of course, there's lots of research on the benefits of having social relationships, a social circle, and even in terms of the health benefits themselves. It seems that if people at least have a few close friends and family, then they tend to age better, even in terms of their physical health. But is that really always the case? I mean, is it always the case that having close social ties relates to better health in old age? I mean, do they always confer benefits or not?
Yes, I think so. Yes. And when we see problems with the social relationships with older people, it's those super close people, the people that, as we define, who are those people in your life that if they were to disappear, your life would never be quite the same. It's always about 4 or 5 people. People put their parents in there, people put their partners, their children, if they have like their close best friend or two. When that group gets to be 2 or fewer, then that affects their well-being. So socio-emotional selectivity theory says that our huge network of social people in our lives decreases with age, but not that inner core. And yet, if that inner core diminishes and there's no people to replace those people, So like if your best friend dies, you never find someone, a good friend of yours that becomes your best friend, or a new person that becomes your best friend, and that core gets smaller and smaller, that is a problem.
Mhm. But I mean, I would imagine that what really matters is for people to have a couple or a few close friends, right? I mean, I wouldn't imagine that you get even more benefits if you try to have like 100 friends or so. I mean, at a certain point, it doesn't matter anymore, right? You don't get more added benefits, and I would imagine that perhaps you would be sacrificing some more closeness with a few people just to spend more time with those other people
Yeah,
out there.
that's a good question. I've never seen a study looking at like who are those inner core and like
Yeah.
the differences in size, other than if it gets to be two or one or
Mhm.
zero, that's the problem. But if
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
three or more, you're good. But I've never seen any study looking at like how, if there's any difference problems with having more or less than besides
Uh,
the two.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was just asking that out of curiosity because,
Yeah.
nowadays, particularly with social media, you go to Facebook, you have 500 friends there, and people care a lot about that. And sometimes, and there are highly social people that have, I don't know, hundreds of acquaintances or
Yes.
something like that. But I guess that like at least 95, probably more, a higher percentage of those people are just people with whom you have positive social interactions, but it's not really close friendships, right?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And those people you're describing are exactly the people that you see decline the most with age, are these peripheral, we call them these peripheral friends. And that's where you see older people are reporting far fewer than younger.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I guess that after this interview, I feel better that I'm already ahead of my teenage and my 20s years. So, and I'm also looking forward to my 60s, I guess, but I'm still a little bit scared of my 40s because you haven't convinced me that middle age will be a good thing.
Well, it's interesting. Like one of the Laura Carson's first studies that really introduced socio-emotional activity theory was this: your social network gets smaller, and so we see this as an old age thing. But she started seeing this kind of selection, and it wasn't that people were saying, "Oh, I want friends, I don't have them." It was like, these are the people in my network, and I'm really happy with them.
Yeah.
She started seeing this in the people in their 30s. So this was a gradual linear experience across age. It wasn't like all of a sudden you're 65 and you're like, okay, no more friends, and at least this part you shouldn't be scared about, the social, because the social is, you're more selective, you're keeping, it's like fine wines, you're like putting out all the bad stuff and you're just keeping the really good stuff.
Yeah. No, I actually like that. I actually like fewer people because it's really bothersome to try to make plans with I don't know what number of people out there. I mean, it's just too much for me, at least. So, yeah. So, is there anything else just that you would like to add that perhaps we have missed in our conversation, just as, I don't know, a final message about effective well-being across the lifespan, or not?
Um, no, you know, old age is generally a pretty good time for a life for emotional well-being. Older people, at least in countries like Portugal and the United States and North America, Western Europe, they um, luckily have these safety nets of retirement, that where they can get some social security of somehow, and so life is pretty good. They
Yeah.
do see studies comparing like Eastern Europe with Western Europe,
Yeah.
and when you live in a place where you don't have that, old age looks a little different. So
Mhm.
I don't want to say, oh, old age is great for everyone. It's like, well, if you live in a war-torn area, or if you live in
Yeah.
some countries in Eastern Europe that don't have the social security and the
Mhm.
financial safety nets that you do, you don't see the well-being getting better with age. But in countries that do have that, you do see it. And so it's a wonderful, it's a wonderful testament to only, it's like the context of aging. It's a wonderful testament to countries that do prioritize taking care of all of its citizens, that we see a healthy aging.
I mean, actually, that's a great point, because at least in more developed societies with lower birth rates and all of that, and aging populations, we're seeing more of this phenomenon of loneliness in old age, and just old people being, I guess, abandoned. And I guess that wouldn't really be good at all for their physical or mental health, right?
Yes, we see that loneliness is actually lower in the 60s than just in the people in their 20s, but after 85, that's when you see loneliness is a problem for older adults. Yeah. And
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, okay, so let's keep that in mind. And just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
So yes, well, if you look at my webpage, I'll try to update it. But it's at UCI. Also, if you go into Google Scholar and just put my name, Susan T. Charles, you can find articles, and a lot of them are free and available to read if you want to do that too. So those are the two places I'd suggest.
Okay, great. So I'm leaving that in the description of the interview for people to check them out. And Dr. Charles, thank you so much again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been really fun to talk to you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for focusing on aging, because it's a fantastic area.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Forte, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Costa, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry D. Lee Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.